When I was here in 97-98 as a NEH Fellow, I was studying the early antiquities legislation in Cyprus. And a year later in England, I came across the records that are the basis for my lecture this evening. And as far as I know, they have not been consulted by any other scholar in the meantime, rather to my surprise. And so I decided to revisit them, pulling out all my old files, partly from a sense of obligation, but also because they make a good story. And because it's best told as a story, I am going to read a text, even though I much prefer to speak informally. The name of Luigi Palma di Cesnola will always be associated with Cyprus and with the Metropolitan Museum in New York. His younger brother Alessandro has received much less attention, and I'm going to refer to him often as Alessandro, because if I say Cesnola, we will all think of his brother Luigi. Alessandro first visited Cyprus in 1873 at Luigi's invitation to help him with his excavations. Using this experience, he assembled his own collection of antiquities between 1876 and 78, while Luigi remained at the Metropolitan Museum. The younger brother has always been overshadowed by his famous sibling, but his own digging career is important because of the event that brought it to an end, the British occupation of Cyprus. In his History of Cyprus, Sir George Hill mentioned the trial of Alessandro, though he confused the two Cesnolas, and gave as a source a published volume of Foreign Office correspondence. Such volumes consist of confidential letters exchanged among members of the British administration and with the Foreign Secretary, the Marquis of Salisbury, in London. This volume, which I name at the top of the screen, which you can see, is hard to find, and that's the one I found by chance when I was back in England. And what I assume to be the same files that are in this volume are among the very few listed in the State Archives here in Nicosia as missing. I'm also going to make use of some of the correspondence of Sir Garnet Wolseley, which is in the British Library, and his published diary. Let me summarize the story. I first identify the Ottoman law under which Alessandro Palma di Cesnola was charged in October 1878. Then I use the evidence of witnesses at his trial to describe his excavation and his arrest. Alessandro was detained overnight, but was then released without penalty, except that his excavated antiquities were confiscated. The next day he protested vehemently that he had been illegally arrested and lodged an appeal with the American consul in Beirut, claiming diplomatic status. This so enraged the British that they summoned him formally for trial. He was found guilty of breaking the Ottoman antiquities law, and 4 months later, in February 1879, he left Cyprus for good. So that's the story in short. I shall end by asking two questions. Why did the High Commissioner proclaim a ban on excavation only 1 month after arriving in Cyprus? And why did Alessandro ignore explicit instructions to observe the ban? In June 1878, Great Britain provisionally took over from Turkey the occupation and administration of the island of Cyprus. An order of 14th September established a legislative council and empowered the High Commissioner to enact laws. The first High Commissioner, Sir Garnet Wolseley, had arrived at Larnaca on the 23rd of July. He brought with him Sir Adrian Dingley, the Crown Advocate of Malta, to advise him on immediate legal issues. Wolseley planned to treat his new territory as an extension of Britain and to Anglicise its institutions and inhabitants. But he soon came to appreciate the sound basis of the Ottoman legal code, based as it was on the Code Napoleon. The current Ottoman law on antiquities dated from 1874. Anyone wishing to search for antiquities in the Ottoman Empire had to obtain an annual firman or permit issued by the Sublime Porte in Constantinople. The terms of a firman were generous in allowing excavated finds to be exported. But in 1869, with the development of the Imperial Ottoman Museum and a growing national interest in antiquities, a new decree forbade the export of finds, other than coins, from excavations. The decree of 1869 came as a shock to excavators. Freelance diggers such as Heinrich Schliemann at Troy and Luigi Palma di Cesnola in Cyprus found various ways to get around the new regulations. Diplomats could help in case of difficulties. For instance, George Henry Borker, minister to the American legation in Constantinople, obtained a firman for Luigi Palma di Cesnola and helped him export his finds. Luigi gratefully gave Borca some gold trinkets from his collection and invited him and his wife for a vacation in the island. But Luigi's massive export of antiquities, challenging the 1869 decree, provoked Constantinople to announce much stricter regulations. This was the law of 1874, which had 36 articles, replacing the 7 articles of the decree of 1869. It was under Article 7 of this new law that Alessandro was arrested. Excavators needed permission from the authorities and from the landowner. Offenders would have their finds confiscated and either be fined or sent to prison. This antiquities law was in force when the British landed in June 1878. But barely 2 months later, the High Commissioner issued a proclamation banning all excavations. According to Georges Perrault, Wolseley announced the ban in August following orders received from England. Several British visitors who were in Cyprus at the time confirmed the existence of the ban. It's mentioned by Samuel Baker, Lady Brassey, and Esme Scott Stevenson. It was this ban that Alessandro decided to ignore. Alessandro was born the youngest of 7 children in Rivarola Canavese, in the Piedmont region of northern Italy. Like his elder brother, Luigi, Alessandro combined a military career with extensive travel that brought him to the New World. In April 1873, he travelled from South America to New York, where Luigi was on leave, working on his collection in the Metropolitan Museum. It was in this building. 3 months later, the two of them left for Cyprus, and Luigi resumed control of digs that had been continuing in his absence. He instructed his brother in his methods and how to manage workmen and local Turkish officials. For reasons that he doesn't disclose, Alessandro left Cyprus against his will in either late 1874 or late 1875. The 2 editions of Salamina give different dates. He returned to the island in July 1876. The intervening months he spent at the British Museum, studying the Oriental collections. In London, he also found a wealthy stockbroker and collector, Edwin Lawrence, to sponsor him, and he returned to Cyprus to acquire antiquities for Lawrence. Working in a way very similar to his brother, Alessandro purchased antiquities and organised excavations. In November 1877, after one of his workmen brought him some promising finds, he redirected all his workforce to Salamis. He reported later that his excavations at Salamis produced the greater part of the future Lawrence Cesnola collection. The British knew of the reputation of Luigi Palma di Cesnola. Even so, they must have been surprised when his younger brother presented himself. Alessandro travelled from Larnaca to the British headquarters camp at Nicosia, in the Kiko Metochi, and asked to see the High Commissioner. Wolseley later wrote to Lord Salisbury in London, I quote, "A Mr. Cesnola called upon me some 6 weeks or 2 months ago and requested permission to dig. I did not see him myself, but the Secretary to the Government, Colonel Greaves, did, and told him that all excavating at present was positively forbidden, and that anyone breaking the law on this point would be punished according to law." End of quote. If Alessandro's visit had been 6 weeks or 2 months ago, it would have been in the second half of August. Alessandro had probably heard of the ban on excavation and hurried to Nicosia to request a permit. He failed to secure one, but decided to ignore the ban. He was used to working without permission. As he confessed in Salamina, he had applied to Constantinople for a firman, but never received a positive answer, so continued digging without it. I have to report that the Foreign Office papers provide no indications as to where in the area of Salamis Alessandro was digging. But we do learn something about his excavations from the testimony given by his workmen following his arrest. As you can see here, 3 men from the village of Encome were sent to Larnaca to make sworn depositions. 2 of them also testified later at the trial, as did a 3rd villager, Yanis Kyriaki. 2 residents of Scala gave sworn depositions. Alessandro Cucomo had worked previously for the Cesnola brothers at Larnaca and Encome. He said he had been re-employed by Alessandro about 6 months ago, dug for him at Encome until 2 months ago, and was then employed to backfill the excavation pits. This was a common practice to avoid paying compensation to the landowner. The other Larnaca man, Jorge Zonino, also had been engaged 6 months ago and worked until the previous Wednesday, that is the 2nd of October. All 5 Encomie workmen gave consistent statements about working for some 6 months. At the start there was about 60 men digging. All were employed by Lazaris Filippi, the servant of Alessandro Palma di Cesnola, and it was Lazaris who stopped the excavations on the 2nd of October. They reported that the American, i.e. Alessandro Palma di Cesnola, visited the site several times. Here you see him visiting after arriving on horseback. His last visit had been 2 months previously, i.e. early August. Lazaris stored the finds in a ruined house in Encomie, to which Panaia Hadji Christofi lent him the keys. Both these statements, that Alessandro had not visited the dig since early August and that the finds were stored at Encomie, will prove to be significant. As his brother Luigi had been, Alessandro was mainly resident in Larnaca. In fact, he divided his time between Larnaca and a summer house in Ormizia, a few hours' ride to the northeast. Ormizia had been the preferred summer resort for merchants of the English Levant Company in Larnaca. The tradition continued among the foreign consuls, including Luigi Palma di Cesnola, who, as American consul, rented a house there in 1873 and used it regularly with his family. Alessandro took over the lease on his brother's departure. The house was a stout building in stone and mud brick of 2 floors, with a large internal courtyard and garden. It belonged to Nicholas Vondiziano, a member of the well-known Cypriot family, resident mainly in Larnaca and Ormizia. The house was later identified on the cadastral survey maps of the island as Cesnola's summer residence. Maria Hadjicosti, in her study of Luigi Palma di Cesnola and Ormizia, reported that it was demolished around 1970. It was Achilleus, the eldest of the 3 sons of Nicholas Vondiziano, who first informed the British authorities about Alessandro. On the 2nd of October, he reported to a police captain in Ormizia that about a fortnight previously, Alessandro had been digging at Encomie, and that he, Vondiziano, had tried to get the workmen to stop, telling them that it was prohibited. The villagers of Ormizia also told a policeman that the work at Encomie was continuing and that the finds were being stored in the house of Panaia. The commissioner in Larnaca, Colonel Henry G. White, forwarded these 2 reports to Colonel George Greaves, the government chief secretary in Nicosia, and asked what action to take. Greaves ordered the local commandant of police in Larnaca, Lieutenant Spencer, to proceed with 3 policemen to Encomie. If Alessandro Palma di Cesnola was excavating, he should be charged under the Turkish antiquities law. The next day, Spencer went to Encomie and found the cemetery with most of the emptied tombs already backfilled. The workmen admitted that they were working for Lazaris. Spencer was convinced that Alessandro had ignored the ban on excavating. He sent to Larnaca some of the workmen to give sworn depositions, as we saw earlier. He also seized the pottery and glass objects that he found in the house of Panaia. Spencer returned to Larnaca and submitted his report to Commissioner White, who immediately forwarded it to Greaves in Nicosia. Events moved fast at this point. White's cover note is timed 10 p.m. In it he observed that Alessandro, while not caught in the act, had undoubtedly directed researches up to the past few days, and under Article 7 of the Antiquities Law, he was liable to punishment. Would Greaves authorise his summary arrest? Greaves replied for the High Commissioner that White should tell Alessandro that he had broken the law and contravened the orders of the High Commissioner. If he repeated the offence, the High Commissioner would imprison him as the law directed. White should seize all the excavated objects. Before this reply reached him, White sent a telegram, a method which was not used very often because it was expensive, reporting that Alessandro had now surrendered himself in Larnaca. He had offered bail and was being detained in a large room in the Konak. This was the building now known as Larnaca Fort. Rita Severis has kindly confirmed to me that it did indeed serve as the British consulate in 1878. The High Commissioner, Sir Garnet Wolseley, still wanted to be lenient and to avoid bringing Alessandro to trial. But as he wrote in his diary, he was extremely irritated to find that, I quote, "a man calling himself Major Cesnola, brother to the man who called himself General Cesnola, had been excavating despite being told distinctly not to. Infernal Italian." The matter might have ended there, and this story and this lecture would have been much shorter. But Alessandro, after a day's reflection, decided to protest vehemently that he had been illegally arrested. If he had not made this protest, he never would have been brought to trial. Alessandro made his first protest when he presented himself at the house of Commissioner White. This was around midday on Sunday, 6th of October. He had arrived from Ormithia, accompanied by Lieutenant Richard Hippersley of the Royal Engineers. The lieutenant had landed at Larnaca on the night of 29th of September from Alexandria, together with his fellow lieutenant Herbert Kitchener. The two of them were due to undertake their trigonometrical survey of Cyprus. Two other passengers who arrived on the same ship were the writer and traveller William Hepworth Dixon, who was writing a book about Cyprus, and Esme Scott Stevenson, whose husband Andrew was shortly to be appointed Assistant Commissioner in Kyrenia. Dixon knew Cyprus well, having first visited 15 years previously. He also knew Alessandro Palma di Cesnola. Soon after Dixon's arrival from Alexandria, he was invited by his friend to stay in the Cesnola country house at Ormithia. He was staying at the house with Alessandro when Lieutenant Spencer stopped there on his way back from investigations at Encomie. Spencer wanted to seal a room in the house that contained antiquities. Dixon is reported to have remonstrated angrily with Spencer. Dixon had fallen from his mule and broken his collarbone while he was riding with Alessandro to the village. He probably would have gone with Alessandro to the commissioner's house the following day, but since he was incapacitated with his broken collarbone, it seems that he asked Lieutenant Hippersley, whom he had met on the ship from Alexandria, to go instead. Within a few days, however, Dixon was to play a more active role. Commissioner White made a formal arrest of Alessandro at his house, and then arranged for him to walk freely to the Connacht building. There he stayed overnight in a large room, it's the same building, a large room specially prepared for him in the offices, not in the jail, which was below. Alessandro was provided with various comforts, for which he repeatedly and warmly thanked White. He had not been charged, but was told that the antiquities in the room sealed by Spencer would be confiscated. Alessandro then offered to go himself to his house and bring in the antiquities, which numbered, he said, only about 36. This would avoid the danger of breakage and would save a police officer having to make a special visit there. Alessandro gave his word of honour and asked for a permit to break the seal that Spencer had affixed. A few hours later, the permit was returned to White. On the same day, Alessandro submitted a complaint to the American consul in Beirut. He had been lawfully arrested, locked up in the Connacht, refused any interview, even with his legal advisor, and he strongly denied all charges against him. He had been now allowed to leave the Connacht, but expected his property to be confiscated. Could the consul help him obtain justice and compensation? The signature to the letter is important. I will come back to that later. Alessandro's English was poor. We can guess that his friend Hepworth Dixon, who was a qualified barrister who never practiced, was the legal advisor, he mentions in the letter, who had helped him with the legal phrasing of this letter. Wolseley thought Dixon a pompous ass and a busybody, and had no doubts that it was he who persuaded Alessandro that he had been disgracefully treated, advising him to break his promise to bring in the antiquities and instead to complain to Beirut. The British had so far treated Alessandro leniently, but this appeal to an American diplomat in Beirut challenged their authority and provoked them into summoning Alessandro for trial before the Mejlis Davi court in Larnaca. The Mejlis Davi was a district court in Larnaca. The order of 14th of September had confirmed that the Ottoman court system would continue in the 6 administrative districts of the island. The jurisdiction of the Davi courts was limited to lower penalties, whether fines or terms of imprisonment, such as those defined in the 1874 Antiquities Law. A Qadi presided over a Davi court with the help of 4 members, 2 Muslim and 2 Christian, who were elected by their communities. The British made an important change to this system by introducing the figure of an assessor. He was usually the British commissioner or assistant commissioner of the district. The assessor heard the pleas, sifted the evidence, and signed the judgment if convinced that the law had been fairly applied. Hepworth Dixon, no doubt drawing on his legal training, commented that in practice the assessor is the court. Both Hepworth Dixon in his book, British Cyprus, and Esme Scott Stevenson in her own book, Our Home in Cyprus, give condescending accounts of observing these Derby courts in action. But they fail to acknowledge that the British assessors, trained in military matters, usually lack the legal or linguistic qualifications for this important role. Falkland Warren wrote that when he first arrived in Cyprus in 1878, I quote, "We who came to assist in the government were to a man ignorant of the laws, languages and customs of the people." Samuel Baker commented in similar terms, I quote, "No officers understood either the language or laws of the people they had to govern. They were for the most part specially educated for the military profession." Within a week of his arrival in the island, Lieutenant Kitchener wrote to his sister about the absurd laws that the British made and that they then have to counter-order. All is in fact chaos, he observed. Wolseley's policy was to appoint military officers rather than civil servants, while replacing local officials. He had brought to Cyprus several members of the Wolseley Ring. This was a group of military officers who had served with him in the Gold Coast or elsewhere and whom he trusted. The Chief Secretary, Colonel George Greaves, who we heard of earlier, was one of the Ring, as was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Brackenbury of the Royal Artillery. Wolseley considered Brackenbury the cleverest man in the British Army and appointed him Chief Commandant of Military Police and Inspector of Prisons. Among the other military officials, Lieutenant M.B. Seeger was Assistant Commissioner in Nicosia and sat as assessor in the Derby court there. He was unusual, perhaps unique, in being trained in the law, albeit English law, having been called to the bar in England. For Alessandro Palma di Cesnola to receive a fair trial without access to counsel, he had to be able to understand the proceedings. The British had expected to conduct official business in English, but found their language to be little used in Cyprus. They brought in interpreters from Turkey and Malta, and recruited others from the Turkish Cypriot, Greek Cypriot and Armenian communities. In the court at Larnaca, with its cosmopolitan population, interpreters translated among languages that might include Turkish, Greek, Italian, French, English and Arabic, maybe also Armenian and Maltese. Their long experience of court business also enabled them to correct the CAARI or the assessor when he was in doubt about points of law, or if he wanted to know of any legal precedents. Alessandro's native language was Italian, which was widely spoken as a lingua franca in the East Mediterranean until its replacement in the 1860s by French. Consuls in Cyprus during the late Ottoman period usually wrote in Italian, sometimes in French. In fact, several consuls and merchants were of Italian descent. Alessandro learned French during his childhood in the Italian Piedmont. His mother was fluent in it, and picked up some English during his 3 months in New York and his longer stay in London. However, at the trial, his spoken English was so poor that he asked for the trial to be conducted in Italian. He was fortunate to have as his interpreter Claude Delaval Cobham, the Assistant Commissioner of Larnaca. Cobham had been an unusual appointment, a civilian with no military background and holding a legal qualification, a Bachelor of Civil Law from Oxford University. Augustus Hare had met him at Oxford when Cobham was preparing to be ordained for the church. He later recommended him to Wolseley as an astonishing polyglot who acquired a new language in a few weeks. Wolseley's letter of recommendation was the end of August, and Cobham was appointed the end of September, so he'd been on the job only a couple of weeks when all this was happening. Cobham's interpreting was crucial in enabling Alessandro to defend himself. It was Cobham who, as Assistant Commissioner, had translated into English the sworn depositions from Alessandro's workmen. He had also written the formal summons for Alessandro to appear before the court in Larnaca. For Sir Garnet Wolseley, what irritated him most was that his secretary had refused Alexander's request for a permit and told him in no uncertain terms not to go on digging. He therefore sent Brackenbury, the police commissioner, to lead the prosecution. I should stress at this point that the Foreign Office papers provide a summary of the trial proceedings. There's no full verbatim court record. Brackenbury opened proceedings by referring to the Antiquities Law and the charge of conducting unauthorised excavations. He then called 7 witnesses. As you saw before, they're listed in the column on the right. The 3 workmen from Encomi, who confirmed that excavations were supervised by Lazaris on the defendant's behalf. Panaia Hadjichrysofi as the owner of the house there. Achilleus Montiziano, who identified in court Alessandro and his servant Lazaris. Lieutenant Spencer, who described his investigations at Encomi and Ormidia. And finally, Lazaris Philippi, who maintained that he had not engaged workmen, they had come of their own accord. Brackenbury then summarised the case for the prosecution and asked for the penalties stipulated in the law if the accused could not show the necessary permit. Alessandro, in his defence, did not deny having conducted excavations. He claimed to have suspended them once the English arrived, and he acknowledged that he had requested a permit. But the main thrust of his defence, as an American and a man, was a protest that the court was not competent to hear the case. It was not a Turkish court, nor yet an English one, he said. He protested about having his possessions confiscated. In nearly every house in Larnaca, he argued, there were antiquities owned and for sale, and he was one among many, including Commissioner White himself, who purchased them. He reserved the right to protest the proceedings and decision of the court. The assessor, Commissioner White, found Alessandro guilty and sentenced him to a fine of 4 liras, which Wolseley immediately cancelled, and the confiscation of the antiquities seized at Encomi and Ormidia. At his trial, Alessandro stressed his status as a foreigner, specifically an American, and also his right to diplomatic titles. On neither basis were his claims justified. Under Ottoman law, a foreigner accused of a crime by a Cypriot was entitled to have his consul present in court. If foreign nationals alone were involved, the Ottoman capitulations enabled them to be tried according to the laws of their own countries in special consular courts. The terms of the Cyprus Convention did not invalidate the capitulations, but the supplementary agreement of 14th of August had transferred all substantive powers from the Sultan to the Queen of England. The capitulations had therefore ceased to be effective. Wolseley certainly thought so. The foreign consuls at Larnaca wrote to him officially, but he replied to them as private individuals. They were accredited to the Sublime Porte, not to England. To settle the matter, on the 11th of October, he issued a proclamation that consular jurisdiction under Sublime Porte regulations no longer had any effect in Cyprus. It cannot be coincidence the very same day Wolseley had received a letter from Alessandro, using diplomatic titles, announcing his appeal to the American consul in Beirut. Alessandro signed his appeal to Beirut as late Vice Consul at Paphos and acting consul in Cyprus for the United States. Most published accounts refer to him as the American Vice Consul in Paphos, but this is not correct. In New York in July 1873, his brother Luigi, still the American consul, had asked the State Department to appoint Alessandro to a position of United States consular agent at Paphos. The request was approved within 2 days. The position of consular agent was of low rank and was often held by a foreign national in a place that lacked a consular service. In US State Department records, the staff list for Cyprus for 1873 has Alessandro Palma di Cesnola's name as consular agent in Paphos, but without as yet an exequatur, that is, a formal document issued by the Turks recognizing his status. In the consular staff lists for the following years, there is no mention of Alessandro's name, nor of a US consular agency at Paphos. Since at least 1870, the US State Department had been thinking of abolishing the consulate on Cyprus, and in 1876 it did so, for financial reasons along with a number of other missions abroad. When the news came through, Luigi, the consul, had already left for another period of leave in New York. So Alessandro, whom Luigi had hoped would deputize for him, had the dispiriting task of lowering the American flag on the consulate building. He offered to provide honorary services for the US State Department, an offer that was turned down. So Alessandro had never acquired any diplomatic status. And from 1876, with the closure of the American consulate, it had definitely been ruled out, as Alessandro later admitted in his Salamina. His workmen often referred to him as the American. Was he even an American citizen? In his request of 1873 to the US State Department, Luigi wrote that Alessandro has declared his intention to become an American citizen, is learning very fast the English language. Very soon after, in the following month, the brothers left the United States for Europe. When first arrested in Cyprus, Alessandro did not claim American citizenship. But after his release, in casual conversation with Commissioner White the following evening, he brought it up. He told White that his claim to US citizenship was not a result of taking out naturalization papers, but was due to his having been in the United States of America on a certain date which gave him and all others in the country their citizens' rights. This claim sounded very improbable and was soon undermined. In December, so 2 months after the trial, the captain of an American man-of-war that called at Larnaca suggested that Alessandro's papers claiming US citizenship should be examined. He was not acting for the United States of America in Cyprus and had never been vice-consul at Paphos. Alessandro's complaint to Beirut as an American citizen was forwarded to the US minister in Constantinople, Horace Maynard, and thence to the State Department. It also went to the British ambassador, A.H. Layard, who sent it to the Marquess of Salisbury in London. Diplomatic exchanges on this case soon ceased, evidently for lack of substance. 3 months later, in the House of Commons in London, Sir Charles Dilke denounced the treatment of Alessandro, referring to him as an American citizen, but it was incorrect. His claims of American citizenship and diplomatic titles were wishful thinking. The number of antiquities purchased or excavated by Alessandro is unknown. When he first moved his team to Salamis in late 1877 or 78, his collection was, he claimed, not a third of what it afterwards became in consequence of this discovery in Salamis. Lieutenant Spencer had seized from Panayir's house at Encomé a relatively small quantity of finds, 4 big baskets, 1 small and 1 pair of panniers. These were perhaps only what had been found since the ban was imposed. The Ormidia house, in contrast, contained large quantities of antiquities. In the corners of the courtyard, Hepworth Dixon reported some thousands of broken terracottas, vases and lamps of ancient workmanship. Spencer, on his second visit there on the 11th of October, opened the sealed upstairs room and removed 6 baskets full of antiquities, but found another room downstairs full of pottery and other finds. After the trial, while the Italian was absent, the police removed from the house over 1,500 items, which they listed by type. On his return from a visit to Beirut, Alessandro claimed that his brother, not he, had excavated them 14 years previously. In the second edition of Salamina, but not the first, Alessandro reported that in 3 years of purchases and digging he had found 14,000 objects, comprising the collection that he sent to Lawrence in London. The first shipment, 6 large cases, left in the winter of 1876-7, and the second one at an unknown date. The second shipment, I think, is likely to have left before the ban on excavation. Whatever antiquities remained in store at the Ormidia house were seized by the British. The finds from Salamis that trebled, as he claimed, the size of his collection must already have been shipped to England. And as Cesnola himself wrote later, his success in gleaning the Lawrence Cesnola collection from Cyprus was due to the kindness of Turkish officials, to whom he was most obliged, whereas with the arrival of the British his excavations ceased. A lavish album sponsored by Lawrence with 62 plates illustrated a selection of objects from their collection and was immediately reprinted. But the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum showed little interest. These antiquities compared poorly with those exhibited in London by his brother Luigi 10 years earlier. Lawrence decided to send his collection to auction. The 4 sales, held between 1883 and 1892, totaled 3,463 lots. The first sale alone saw 3,000 objects sold at modest prices. How many objects from Salamis and other sites Alessandro acquired is unknown. He claimed never to have sold antiquities, but to have made gifts to visitors. He certainly donated some to the local archaeological society in his native Piedmont and to members of his family in Italy. The seized antiquities, which were stored in Commissioner White's house, became quite a visitor attraction. In 1882 they could have gone to the new Cyprus Museum in Nicosia, but 10 years later they were still in Cobham's house in Larnaca. Eventually some of them went to the museum, as we know from the catalogue of Unpublished Richter and Myers. There remain 2 questions. Why did Wolseley, a military man with no known interest in antiquities, announce a ban on excavation in August 1878? And why did Alessandro deliberately flout this ban? The answer to the first question owes much apparently to the British Museum. In July, with the news of Britain's occupation of Cyprus still fresh, Charles Newton sent a report to the trustees about the archaeological potential of the island. The government might reserve the right to explore all ancient sites, he proposed, just as Greece had done after the end of Ottoman rule. It was preferable to have government control of archaeology, and it was cheaper to excavate than to buy antiquities. His remarks were conveyed to the Foreign Office, which passed them on to Wolseley. In August, Wolseley issued his proclamation banning excavations, which Perrault stated was made on orders from England. 2 months later, Wolseley wrote of wanting to give priority to British researchers, hoping that the British Museum would send a qualified man to direct excavations. Still smarting from the trial and confiscation of his antiquities, Alessandro in May 1880 applied to Newton to direct excavations in Cyprus for the British Museum. Reporting to the trustees, Newton was sympathetic to Alessandro's version that he had been badly treated, but strongly doubted whether the Foreign Office would overlook his previous arrest. In the end, the museum turned down the Italian's offer, not because of his record, but he was asking too high a salary. Despite being rebuffed, Alessandro continued to enjoy support from the museum's curators. Samuel Birch had helped him in his earlier studies in London. Birch wrote a note for the album of 1880 and a flattering introduction to Salamina, and Birch and Newton together successfully nominated him for election as a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. Alessandro's situation had been much less assured after he returned from London to Cyprus in 1876. Once the American consulate had been abolished a few months later, he could not expect even the small income from diplomatic service that his brother Luigi had had. He therefore depended entirely on his sponsor, Edward Lawrence, to finance his search for antiquities. One of Lawrence's principal interests was stone sculpture. The Salamis tombs produced abundant pottery, glass, metal and small stone finds, but, as Alessandro admitted, without a permit he could not take the risk of retrieving, transporting and exporting large objects. As he himself wrote, he could not fulfill all his sponsor's wishes. His purchase of the Larnaca tympanum seems to be a sign of Alessandro's gullibility, if not desperation, to come up with a treasure for his sponsor. As Hetherington has shown, the sculpture is of dubious antiquity and provenance. It is also significant that 6 months after returning to London, Alessandro married Augusta, the younger of Lawrence's 2 daughters. If this had already been a prospect while Alessandro was in Cyprus, he would have been more than usually anxious to meet the requirements of his sponsor, who was also his future father-in-law. Alessandro was therefore under considerable moral and financial pressure. He could not afford to respect the ban on excavations. He decided to continue digging. He maintained a low profile by keeping the finds at Encomie and by no longer visiting the site. but the rumour of his illicit excavations still continuing was bound to spread via Omidia to Larnaca and led inevitably to the end of his career in Cyprus. Thank you very much.